Kristy works here at JCCC and the Sustainability Center. She previously served in similar roles in 2 other institutions. Here, she is the Sustainability Education and Engagement Coordinator, there's a good title for you, supporting the Student Sustainability Committee, the Student Environmental Alliance, and curriculum development for faculty through the Sunflower program, which I was a part of. She holds a master's degree in social responsibility and sustainable community development. These are all such wonderful titles. From Western Kentucky University. She has a bachelor's degree plus about 30 graduate hours in history from the University of Southern Mississippi. So she's a well-rounded girl. In addition to her sustainability work, she's an avid reader, which kind of brings her to this, knitter. We should hold up one of her items there. Let's showcase her knitting. There we go. Photographer, cook, musician, and more. The girl does not lack for hobbies. My first brush with Kristy was when she served as a guest speaker in my Comp 2 class as we embarked on a paper about the history of the conservation and environmentalist movements. With Kristy's guidance, we examined the foundational ideas of Roosevelt and Pinchot. We went with Thoreau, it was harder to say than I thought, to the woods, where in his solitude, he measured and recorded the landscape around him. We looked at those same woods 150 years later in Richard Primack's Walden Warming. These ideas and more come to fruition in Phillip Connor's Fire Season. Kristy's first brush with Fire Season came during her graduate work at Western Kentucky, when she was working far more than full-time and found herself ensnared in the foreign landscape of the, is it Gila Mountains? All right. The book's lessons about the saving graces of disconnection, solitude, quiet observation have remained vitally important to her ever since. So please welcome Kristy as she talks about Fire Season.
Thank you, Marilyn, for that. I always hear people do introductions and wonder who in the world they're talking about and wonder, is that really me? So one of the things that Marilyn mentioned here is that we're in the Great Books series, right? And as I think back on getting that first email from Maureen about picking a book for this, I think I may have gone about my choice a little bit differently than my colleagues did. We are not reading Milton or Vonnegut. So when Maureen and I had that initial conversation, we talked about a book that was important to us in our current role on campus. And so that's what my thought process was when I picked this one. As Maureen mentioned, I was working far more than full-time in a brand new graduate program, and I didn't know what in the world I was doing, and I was terrified when I first came across this book. It was recommended and not required as one of my first graduate classes, and I sincerely believe that if that man had suggested I read the back of every cereal box in the grocery store as recommended reading, I probably would have done it, right? It was that sense of terror, like, what have you done? So he suggested that we read this book. I sat down, I picked it up, and I found that it really spoke to me in ways that other books that I've loved through my career have also done. So Walden is one of those books that's always really spoken to me, but there's also, for those of you who are familiar with Walden, a little bit of finger pointing and a little bit of shaming, and you should feel guilty that you're not doing this, right? And you don't get that here. That's one of the things that I enjoy about this particular work. So Fire Season isn't a great book in that sense of it having this huge footprint on American literature, but it's a special book to me. And when Lee Pelton was here, one of the things that he mentioned was that the best great book you can have is the one that changes the way you view the world, and it's the one that you're reading right now, right? And so that's sort of what that book is here too. So we're going to talk about 3 valuable lessons, and then I want to get into a little bit of discussion with y'all and see what those of you who've read it may think about the work. 3 valuable lessons that the book brought me. Let's see if this is going to work. Yes. It does work. It does. So 3 really special lessons that this book brought to me are the value of taking chances and taking that blind leap of faith and not really knowing what's going to happen on the other side. The value of solitude and the value of disconnectedness, even in a time when we all want to continue to build community. There's something to be said for quiet contemplation and reflection. And then the value of observation. And I think those last two go hand in hand, obviously, for clear reasons. But as we give a little context for each one of these points from the work that Connors does, maybe it'll be more clear how they all work together. So Phil Connors, in this work, finds himself in the midst of a job choice that is terribly, terribly ill-timed. He's embarking into print journalism at a point in our national ethos where print journalism is declining. And not just declining, but tanking. And so he takes a look at himself as a reporter in New York, and he says, what in the world have I done? This is not where I need to be. And a friend reaches out to him and says, would you like the chance to go and sit on top of a fire tower by yourself for 5 months? And he says, well, that's novel. He talks to his friends think he's crazy, he thinks about the idea, he wonders if he's crazy himself, and he says yes. And so he goes to a place, there's us, there's him. He goes to a place in the middle of nowhere. He's literally 30 miles from the Mexican border. He is sitting in the midst of trees and meadows and mountains and wildlife and streams and no people. He talks about, and we'll mention this a little bit later, the only way he's able to correspond with anyone is via the United States Postal Service. So that's sort of a novel way of looking at the world for someone who's typically connected via email and social media and everything else. And so he has to sort of reflect on how his changing relationship with the world is going to look when he's up here on this fire tower. He tells us through this work that he's put together, he tells us a number of stories. He gives us vignettes and gorgeous, he paints beautiful pictures of the things that he's seeing around himself every day. But he also tells us the story, as Marilyn mentioned, of how we got the United States Forestry Service and how we got the United States Park Service. And he contextualizes this history that I absolutely adore. He contextualizes it in his own experience. And I think that may point to another lesson in this work, that it's really important that we contextualize broader historical narratives into our own experiences as citizens, as we share those experiences with those around us. So that's maybe a fourth lesson that I should have included here. But it's one thing that's really important to me in the way that he tells that story of how we got the National Park Service. So he goes through Pinchot and Muir and all of that, and we're not going to go into the details there because it's a really great story and it's a really sort of long and involved story. But one of the pieces that he teases out and repeats over and over again are the mistakes and lessons that we've learned about fire use. Now, obviously, fire is why he's there. So this is what the world looks like around him. And he's surrounded by trees and some trails. And he embarks on 5 months of fire watching. So that is Connors Tower, and that's his cabin. He has some great nature photography on his website. You can actually go and see through his eyes what he saw while he was there, and almost all of these pictures are his. But he embarks on this 5 months of fire watching, and he tells us a little bit about his experiences. And one of my favorite passages, if you'll grant me the latitude to read a little bit, deals with his ability to process being bored, whatever bored means for you. So that thing some people call boredom in the correct, if elusive dosage, can be a form of inoculation against itself. Once you struggle through that swamp of monotony, where time bogs down and excruciating ticks from your wristwatch, it becomes possible to break through to a state of equilibrium, to reach a kind of waiting and watching that verges on what I can only call the holy. One indisputable charm of being a lookout is the sanction it offers to be shed of the social imperative of productivity, to slip away from the big group hug of a digital culture enthralled with social networking, the hive mind, and efficiency defined as connectedness. I often think of a line from Aldo Leopold: "Nothing could be more salutary at this stage than a little healthy contempt for a plethora of material blessings." I want to lengthen, not shorten my attention span, and most of the material splendors of the 21st century bully me in the opposite direction. The fault is mine, I'll admit. I'm too slow-witted, reluctant to evolve, constitutionally unable to get with the program. I can't afford the newest gadgets, and I'm not a natural multitasker. And this part is me to a T. Whether by solitary temperament or sheer cussedness or some unholy amalgam of the two, I prefer to live at least part of the year out here on the edge, where worship of the material recedes and acquaintance with the natural becomes possible, and where I carry on my most important conversations through the United States Postal Service, a month elapsing between missives from one side or the other. That seems about right for most things worth saying. So when I look at how Phil Connors talks about his time up in that tower and in that little red cabin, you know full well that Connors is comfortable with being alone. Not only is he comfortable with it, he seeks that opportunity. And that's not something that we're accustomed to hearing or doing in our current climate, right? He's developed this skill of being at ease in his own skin in a way that most of us can only think of. You know, waiting a month between letters. I have occasionally been guilty of sitting there waiting for the 3 dots on iMessage to stop blinking so the person will go ahead and finish the text message, right? So this is something that is so foreign to the way we operate today. And maybe comfort in solitude is something that we can all try to work on a little bit better. So Connors sits on top of this big giant pile of Tinker Toys, and he watches, and he writes, and he reflects, and he watches for smoke. And that's the third lesson that I've hung on to here. He is in a world that seems overwhelming. He's in the midst of personal and professional crisis, and the first thing he decides to do is to sit back and watch, and to sit back and watch carefully, and to not overreact, and to use the tools of his trade, the Osborne Firefinder, that's kind of hard to say, the Osborne Firefinder, to locate and pinpoint and then radio in smokes as he sees them. So he uses the tools he's been given and the skills he's got to do something about the things that he sees, but only after contemplation. He calls that fire in and he waits, and then he takes care of the people who come to help put out that fire. While he waits between smokes, he writes. So in a series of interviews after this book came out, Connors explains that he didn't write it, obviously, all in one go, but he wrote it in a way that's sort of different in terms of his own writing process than many of us might think about. He wrote a series of almost like journal entries back to his editor, typed those up, mailed those in. When his editor told him of something that really turned him on in what he'd written, he'd explore it further. If he said something was really terrible, he'd drop it. And so all of this was sort of assembled out of these brief sort of journalistic reflections. And they weren't even cobbled into a cohesive whole with one voice until he got back down off the fire tower and was back in New York tending bar. So there are two sort of paths of reflection here, right? There's the first one where he's watching what's going on every day, but then there's the second one, months removed, where he's back in New York and he's making drinks every day. And he's having to reflect on all of those memories again. And I think that might be the other lesson about observation, is that it's important to reflect on what we've said about ourselves from different points in our lives, because different vantage points afford us different observations. So I think along the way, we see this value not only of revisiting and revising the things that we write as students, or since we don't have many students here, or as faculty, but we also see this really inherent value in self-criticism and reflection as well. But again, above all, the reason that I love this book is the meat of being able to be observant and quiet and still and patient and watchful. And I think maybe that's the bigger lesson for us all, especially today.
Good question. So we're, it's not a huge city, but it's a city here. And I'm curious for all of you, when you want to be in solitude in nature, we're not near the mountains, we're kind of here. Where do you go?
I go to the Arboretum.
Okay, I hadn't thought about that. And can you get away from people sort of at the Arboretum?
It's very big.
The Overland Park Arboretum?
I like the Kill Creek Park. It's not very far from here either, but it's a newer park in Johnson County, and it's just oftentimes absolutely deserted, but it has a terrain and landscape that reminds me of the Flint Hills, which is where I'd really rather be.
I spend an enormous amount of time by myself, and I have a garden, and that I tell everybody about. And I actually am it's very contemplative experience. And I had a neighbor when I lived in Paducah, Kentucky, who was many decades older than myself, and she had a big garden in her backyard, and we sort of talked over the fence. And she would point out the minutest changes in her, the foliage of a flower. And I'm thinking, Mama, did you see that? And now that I'm like elderly myself, it's like the interaction with the natural world can be on a very micro level. It's as much as being in a larger venue, I think. Probably not much religion.
No, I think that's perfect. I think that's perfect. I mean, I grew up in the country, so being in suburban Johnson County is still very different for me in some ways, and always being surrounded by people is sort of odd. And so my way of getting away from stuff and people is running. I mean, I'm sort of divorced from I'm present. That would be horribly unsafe if I weren't. But I am, in a way, divorced from reality. I'm sort of not paying attention that much to everything that's going on around me. I'm on a sidewalk. I'm comfortable. I'm happy. All of the above. That's my runaway place in more ways than one. What else?
When did the book come out?
2011.
And is it a book that what was its reception after it came out? Was it a bestseller?
No, it was not. It did win a couple of book prizes. One dealing with nature writing, obviously. One of the best reviews or interviews I've seen about it was in the Parish Review. So Connors has written for the Parish Review for years, and he did an extended recorded interview with Parish right after the book came out. And it's great because that's where he talks a lot about his writing process and how he got to the book, and his contemplations while he was there and all of that. The previous work that he'd done that got a lot of really good press dealt with the suicide of his younger brother. And so there's, and that he touches just a very little bit, very briefly on that here. But you can tell that he's still trying to work through that event in his life, both in the way he talks about this work and the way he talks about his relationship with the other pieces he's done. He also talks some about 9/11, so he was in New York for 9/11.
What does he do now?
He's still writing. Freelancing mostly.
Yeah, and barking.
Yes, and still well, I found a recent interview where he said, just like last year, where he said he may be able to stop tending bar. So
he may be able
to stop tending bar. That constant interaction with people, he says he just finds it draining, and this is his way to get away from it. So, and he and his wife are still married. She's still a nurse. He met his wife in New York and hauled her away to the high desert, and she freaked out about everything, and she's really patient with him about this seclusion that he goes into every year. But they're still together, and still happy, all of the above.
He doesn't go with them?
No. He is married.
He during this 5-month period?
Yes.
And he's done it more than once?
Yes. He does it every year. So the 2009 would have been the first year that he did it. They got married in 2010, and he goes every year. And she doesn't come. She'll come and stay in Silver City and see him when he comes down for weekends, but other than that, she does not follow him.
So it's like being married to an astronaut.
A little bit.
So these positions, the fire towers, those are going away?
In some cases, where I grew up, we have fire towers all over because we were in longleaf pine managed forest, and those fire towers are no longer in use. They use drones there quite a bit more, but these towers, especially in these more deserted areas, are still being used in the very same way that they've been used since the 50s. That black and white picture I have of the woman siding with the firefinder, that's from the 50s. And that's the other thing I thought was interesting that I wish he'd explored a little bit more, is that women were really, really, really active in this role in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. They were seen as being effective and efficient and close observers and capable of dealing with the solitude that they had to. So I love that there's also that sort of gendered comment on women's roles there.
In the cultural part of this, there are a lot of cultures that insist on, I don't know, large families, people living in close proximity to one another, and that in order to go into kind of a solitary place, it requires an act of countercultural will, and it requires money. And so which a lot of people don't have access to. So is there any kind of, does he ever address the issue of about the extraordinary opportunity that he has here to learn, but that it's very limited to most of the human population at the moment?
Well, and he does talk briefly about the privilege, the economic privilege that he has to have this opportunity. So he talks about that side and the fact that he's not, as he calls it, the fire circus, the fire service. The fire service doesn't pay that well, but it's well enough for he and his wife to still make their bills and all of that. The thing that he explores in quite a bit more detail is perhaps his wife's patience with him continuing to indulge in this self-imposed solitude for half the year. And his wife's family was very understanding of it as well. The thing that he explores there a little bit is right at the end of the book, he talks about his father-in-law being very ill and his wife having to travel from Silver City, which is where she was staying when she was there with him, back to New York. And his father-in-law passed away not long after that. But he talks a little bit in interviews about how proud his father-in-law was that he had been able to have this opportunity to reflect, because he felt like on the times that his daughter came out to visit, she also had an opportunity to come more to terms with what was going on in their family. So I think maybe it's sort of this perfect storm of people who really understand and appreciate that as well. I know my family would not appreciate if I decided I was going to run off and live on a boat for 5 months of the year. Not that I've ever thought about that. But yeah, I don't think many of us have that sort of indulgence.
A luxury.
Yeah.
It's really a luxury.
Mm-hmm. And it's a luxury in a lot of different ways. So.
In some cases, I think it really generates this genre of writing. I mean, I think that he's hardly alone in his journey for 5 months of solitude. I mean, you just have to go to the bookstore.
Right.
And start browsing travel, and you'll notice lots and lots of these kinds of narratives. Maybe it's Alaska. I always think of Into the Wild, and the iconic nature of that book, and how it really taps into something that is very much a part of the American psyche, the desire to get to the wilderness without actually having the luxury or the capacity or the true want to do it. You want to live it through somebody else.
Kind of, going on that, where do you see Connor kind of fitting in with that in that genre. You know, he kind of in the introduction, he kind of references Walden, you know, Desert Solitaire, all of them. Where does he kind of fit in?
You know, as I mentioned earlier, I read him as closer to Walden than to Kerouac. And that's probably because I like Walden better than Desert Solitaire, but you know, what do you do? So that, you know, betrays my own bias. But I read him as closer to Thoreau, but without the finger pointing and the shaming. And because when I read this work, even when I read it again over the weekend, I still don't ever get that sense of guilt. You should be doing this too. And that's one of the things that I've loved about it. He freely acknowledges the privilege that he has to be able to do what he's doing, and so there's no real sense of, well, now I feel like a terrible person at the end of this book.
I mean, Thoreau had Mrs. Emerson doing his laundry.
I know.
You talk about, I mean, essentially the guy was kind of a sham. I'm not saying,
Miles outside
I'm
of
not
town.
saying,
They had a lot of friends.
that I don't agree with some of his principles, but I wouldn't feel guilty.
Well, yes.
Some of the most interesting parts to me were like the policy parts, the fire suppression, or where you build roads.
Yes. Well, and not only that, the other thing that the first time I read this, it really bothered me, and now it bothers me a little bit less. So there's a section of the book where he makes the mistake of picking up a fawn. A fawn. Oh, okay. So he picks up a fawn, and he feeds the fawn. He gives it some like funky old soy milk powder that he finds in the back of a cabinet or something. He feeds the fawn. He makes a terrible mistake because he's been told by wildlife to leave the fawn to die. And he describes listening to this and this sort of his own agony at listening to the fawn's death. It's heartbreaking, I know, I'm sorry. So he describes this entire event almost in the context of talking about broader mistakes in policy. So he says, you know, not only did I really mess up here, you know, I made a very personal mistake that I'm going to have to live with and navigate, but look at how my personal mistake also fits in to problems that we've had with effective land management and effective fire policy. And look, we are not perfect, and the best we can do is try to learn from our mistakes and fix our responses in the future accordingly. And I think that may be the more powerful reflection on policy and errors and how we navigate our ways around them, for me at least. You know, being able to admit that you've not only screwed up, but that you're willing to learn from that mistake takes a certain self-reflection that not many of us have.
So, and not just learn from your mistake, but learn from nature.
Exactly. Thank y'all. I appreciate it.